Tokyo, Japan, March 15, 1942. The pale morning light filtered through the rice paper windows of General Hideki Tojo's office at the Imperial Headquarters. The Japanese Prime Minister, in his impeccably pressed military uniform and round-rimmed glasses gleaming, studied maps of Southeast Asia spread across his mahogany desk. Each map was marked with red Japanese flags showing recent conquests. Malaya, conquered. Singapore, fallen. Indonesia, under Japanese control. French Indochina, occupied. In just 3 months since Pearl Harbor, the Empire of the Rising Sun had executed one of the most successful military campaigns in modern history. But the real prize wasn't the islands or the oil fields. It was rubber. Intelligence reports confirmed what Tojo had meticulously planned. Japan now controlled 97% of all world natural rubber production. The rubber plantations of Malaya, the estates of Indonesia, the forests of Indochina, all now served the empire. Without rubber, the Americans couldn't manufacture tires for their B-17s, seals for their warships, or boots for their soldiers. Tojo allowed himself a rare smile. His advisors entered with the latest report on American estimates. United States reserves would last 6 months at most. Tojo spoke calmly, but his words carried the weight of inevitability. We have cut America's industrial arteries. They have impressive factories, yes, but without rubber they are merely empty buildings full of useless machines. In 6 months, when their reserves run out, their war machine will simply stop. We don't need to defeat them in every battle. Just wait for their own dependence on natural resources to paralyze them completely. The officers present nodded in approval. Resource blockade was perfect strategy. What Tojo couldn't comprehend was that the Americans weren't bound by traditional rules of natural resource scarcity. While Japan executed a blockade strategy that would have worked perfectly in 1918, the United States was about to reinvent industrial organic chemistry and create an entire industry from scratch at speed that defied all construction logic. Synthetic rubber wasn't merely an emergency substitute for natural rubber. It was the perfect embodiment of American industrial mentality. When reality doesn't cooperate, manufacture a new reality. In 18 months that Japan considered impossible, the United States would build 51 massive chemical factories from absolute nothing, develop completely new polymerization processes, train tens of thousands of specialized chemical workers, and transform production from 8,000 tons per year to 840,000 tons per year. A growth of more than 100 times. Synthetic rubber would prove that in total industrial warfare, natural resources are completely irrelevant when you can simply manufacture abundance through chemical ingenuity and absolute industrial capacity. The mathematics of disparity were already being written in chemical laboratories and industrial plants that no Japanese strategist could imagine existing at necessary scale. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, the United States produced only 8,000 tons of synthetic rubber per year, less than 1% of total national rubber consumption. The nation depended 92% on natural rubber imports, primarily from Southeast Asia. When Japan cut that supply in December 1941, it had every right to believe it had inflicted a mortal wound on American industrial capacity. But by 1945, just 4 years later, the United States was producing 840,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually. More synthetic rubber than the entire world produced of natural rubber before the war. Nazi Germany, which had pioneered synthetic rubber called Buna in the 1930s and had a decade's technical advantage, produced approximately 115,000 tons at its production peak in 1943. The United States, starting essentially from zero in 1942, produced 7 times more than the Germans at peak. The speed of industrial construction violated all known norms of productive capacity development. Between January 1942 and December 1944, the United States built 51 gigantic synthetic rubber factories completely from scratch. Each factory was a massive chemical complex costing between $10 and $50 million, employing thousands of workers, and processing tens of thousands of tons of petrochemical raw materials monthly. The entire program cost approximately $700 million, equivalent to $11 billion in 2025 values. It was the second largest American industrial project of the war, second only to the Manhattan Project. And each factory was built in 12 to 18 months, a timeline that industrial engineers considered impossible for chemical complexes of this complexity. Conventional chemical plants took 3 to 5 years to build. The Americans were building them in 1/3 the time, while also expanding every other war industry simultaneously. The transformation of dependence was absolute and irreversible. In 1941, the United States imported 980,000 tons of natural rubber, 92% of all consumption. In 1945, 87% of all rubber used by the Allies was American synthetic. Synthetic rubber didn't just replace natural, it exceeded it in absolute volume, making the Japanese blockade completely and permanently irrelevant. Each Sherman tank required half a ton of rubber for tires, seals, and insulation. Each B-17 bomber needed almost a complete ton. Each warship had more than 20,000 individual components made of rubber. American synthetic production not only kept these machines running, it enabled production at scale that defied Japanese comprehension of industrial capacity. On January 28, 1942, 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt created the Rubber Reserve Company and appointed William Jeffers as Rubber Czar, with almost dictatorial powers over all related industry. Jeffers, president of Union Pacific Railroad, had no chemistry background, but had a reputation for making impossible things happen on schedule. His first action was to coordinate an unprecedented industrial consortium that violated all norms of commercial competition and intellectual property. Standard Oil of New Jersey would provide all its proprietary petrochemical processing technology. DuPont and B.F. Goodrich would share polymerization processes developed over decades. Goodyear, Firestone, General Tire, and U.S. Rubber would build and operate factories using competitors' technologies. The federal government would invest $700 million directly, eliminating all private financial risk. It was war socialism applied to industrial chemistry, and it worked with efficiency that would shock economists for decades. The technical challenge was monumental. Natural rubber is coagulated latex from the Hevea brasiliensis tree, an isoprene polymer with unique elastic properties. Replicating those properties artificially required polymerizing butadiene derived from petroleum with styrene to create a copolymer called GRS, government rubber styrene, later known as SBR, styrene butadiene rubber. The process required catalytic cracking of petroleum fractions to produce butadiene, distillation of benzene to produce styrene, and then emulsion polymerization in large reactors. Each step required precise control of temperature, pressure, and catalyst concentrations. German chemists at IG Farben had developed versions of these processes in the 1930s, producing Buna S. But German industrial fragmentation and resource scarcity prevented true mass production. The Americans would take basic German chemistry and transform it into an industrial system operating at scale Germans considered theoretically impossible. The first large-scale factory was built in Akron, Ohio, by Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, beginning operations in April 1942. But it was only a prototype. True scale would come with factories in Texas and Louisiana, where crude oil and natural gas provided cheap raw materials. The Humble Oil and Refining Company plant, a Standard Oil of New Jersey subsidiary in Baytown, Texas, became the symbol of American industrial speed. Construction began in August 1942. 14 months later, in October 1943, the factory was in total operation, producing 30,000 tons of synthetic rubber per year, more than all German Buna industry combined. The complex employed 12,000 workers operating in 3 24-hour shifts. Covering more than 1,000 acres, the plant processed millions of gallons of crude oil monthly through a labyrinth of distillation towers, polymerization reactors, storage tanks, and piping systems extending for kilometers. Baytown construction veterans would report decades later with persistent incredulity about the project's speed. James Henderson, construction supervisor, wrote in his memoirs, "We built an entire chemical city from nothing in little more than a year." German engineers who visited after the war told us it took them 3 to 4 years to build similar facilities, and theirs were smaller. We worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Materials arrived on trains that never stopped. Welders worked by spotlight at night. When we finished one section, it was already being commissioned while we were still building the next. I never saw anything like it before or after. The Baytown factory alone produced more synthetic rubber monthly than Japan could extract from all conquered Malayan rubber plantations. It was devastating irony. The natural resources Tojo had conquered were exceeded by a single chemical factory in Texas. Innovation wasn't just in scale but in technical iteration speed. When first batches of GRS proved inferior to natural rubber in certain applications, particularly truck tires that overheated under heavy load, American chemists modified formulations in weeks. They added antioxidants, adjusted butadiene-styrene ratios, developed improved vulcanization processes. In 6 months, cold GRS processed at lower temperatures produced rubber with properties superior to natural for many applications. Synthetic rubber tires lasted longer under combat conditions. Seals remained flexible in more extreme temperatures. Insulation resisted chemicals better. Synthetic rubber was no longer inferior substitute. It was often superior. And it was being produced in volumes that made comparisons with natural production absurd. Japanese intelligence documents captured after the war reveal growing incredulity about American industrial capacity. A Naval Intelligence Section report dated October 1943 stated, "Initial estimates of American dependence on imported natural rubber were completely correct. Estimates of their capacity to create synthetic substitutes were wrong by a factor of at least 10. Intelligence sources indicate Americans are not rationing rubber as anticipated. They are manufacturing synthetic rubber in quantities that defy all known industrial logic. Each individual factory we managed to identify produces more than all natural production of conquered territories in Southeast Asia. If reports are correct, natural rubber blockade failed completely in its strategic objective." Another report from March 1944 was even more direct. "We must conclude that Americans abolished their dependence on natural resources through industrial means. This represents capacity beyond any known model of industrial warfare. We don't know how to combat an enemy that can manufacture resources when natural resources are denied." German reports from IG Farben, the chemical giant that had pioneered Buna rubber development in the 1930s, showed mixture of technical pride and strategic horror. Karl Crouch, IG. Farben production director and member of the Reich Research Council, wrote in an internal memorandum from December 1943, "Americans took our Buna processes, which we developed over 15 years of intensive research, and transformed them into industrial scale we never imagined possible. For every ton of Bunas we produce with all our mobilized resources, they produce 50 tons. It's not a question of superior chemistry. Our chemistry is provably equivalent or superior. It's pure question of absolute industrial capacity. They have unlimited petroleum. They have unlimited construction capacity. They have unlimited workforce. They can build in 1 year what takes us 3 to design. This isn't industrial competition. It's demonstration of productive power that has no parallel in history." While building synthetic revolution, Americans simultaneously mobilized emergency natural sources through a program that revealed their tendency for massive redundancy. The Washington Accords of 1942 established partnership with Brazil to extract latex from the Amazon, a region that had been the world's largest source before Asian plantations replaced it in the early century. The Brazilian government mobilized 55,000 rubber soldiers, workers sent to the Amazon jungle in brutal conditions to extract latex from wild rubber trees. It was a larger number than the 25,000 Brazilian soldiers sent to fight in Italy. Ironically, when Amazon production finally reached significant volume in 1944, American synthetic rubber had already completely resolved the crisis. Brazilian natural rubber became redundant before reaching factories. It was perfect proof of American mentality. Solve each problem through multiple simultaneous solutions, any one of which would be sufficient alone. If synthetic rubber failed, there would be Amazon rubber. If both failed, there would be aggressive conservation and recycling. If everything failed, there would be equipment redesigned to use less rubber. Japan bet that one solution, natural resource control, would guarantee victory. The Americans implemented 5 solutions simultaneously, and all worked. The transformation of American chemical workforce was as impressive as physical construction. In 1941, the United States had approximately 1,000 chemists with rubber polymerization experience, a specialized field requiring years of training. By 1945, it had more than 30,000 qualified technical workers operating complex chemical processes in 51 factories. Universities created accelerated chemical training programs. Oil refinery workers were retrained in polymer chemistry. Thousands of women entered the chemical workforce for the first time, operating equipment that men considered too complex for female operation. War propaganda was pragmatic. If you can follow a recipe, you can follow a chemical process. And it worked. By 1944, female operators in synthetic rubber plants were producing higher volumes with less waste than their male counterparts, simply because they followed procedures with greater precision. Democratization wasn't just of military firepower, it was of industrial technical capacity. Tokyo, Japan, August 10, 1945. Admiral Soemu Toyota, Chief of the Naval General Staff and last Supreme Commander of Japanese Armed Forces, sat alone in his office in the final days before inevitable surrender. Hiroshima had been destroyed by an incomprehensible weapon 4 days earlier. Nagasaki disappeared yesterday. The Soviet Union had declared war and invaded Manchuria. The empire was in total collapse. But Toyota wasn't reading reports of lost battles. He was studying the last industrial intelligence report on Allied production, particularly American. The numbers were simply incomprehensible to accept. In December 1941, Japanese naval intelligence analysts had calculated with mathematical precision that the United States had approximately 6 months of strategic rubber reserves after complete Southeast Asian blockade. It was a solid estimate based on known consumption and reported reserves. In March 1942, General Tojo had declared with absolute confidence that the American war machine would halt by September 1942. But now, in August 1945, not only had the Americans not stopped, they had increased military production by more than 400% compared to 1941. Every category of equipment, aircraft, tanks, trucks, ships, was being produced in numbers that defied all logic of limited natural resources. The intelligence report explained the impossible. The Americans had built an entire chemical industry in less time than Japan took to administratively consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia. Each individual American factory produced more synthetic rubber monthly than all rubber plantations of Malaya, Indonesia, and Indochina combined produced annually. Japan's perfect strategic blockade, the blow that should guarantee victory through resource strangulation, had been made completely irrelevant not by military counteroffensive, but by chemical engineering and industrial construction at scale that defied all Japanese understanding of productive capacity. Toyota realized with devastating clarity that they had committed fundamental strategic error. They had fought a 19th century war of natural resource control against a 20th century enemy that could manufacture resources when convenient. Toyota wrote in his final notes, preserved after surrender and now in historical archives, "We committed fundamental strategic error that no tactics or courage could overcome. We thought modern warfare was about controlling natural resources, oil, rubber, ores. We didn't understand that for Americans, resources aren't found in nature. They're manufactured in factories. They don't need rubber trees because they can create superior rubber in chemical complexes. They don't need our Southeast Asian conquest because they can abolish necessity through engineering. We didn't fight against common nation. We fought against industrial capacity that can eliminate scarcity through chemistry and productive will. There exists no blockade strategy that defeats this. There exists no tactical victory that overcomes this absolute industrial disparity. Final statistics tell the story of industrial transformation without parallel in human history. In 1941, the United States produced 8,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, less than 1% of national consumption. In 1945, it produced 840,000 tons per year, a growth of more than 10,000% in 4 years. During all of World War II, American industry produced approximately 2.3 million tons of total synthetic rubber. To contextualize this scale, it was more rubber than all aggregated global consumption of natural rubber from 1900 to 1935. The Americans had compressed 35 years of global consumption into 4 years of synthetic production. 51 factories were built between 1942 and 1944, a rate of more than 2 new massive chemical plants per month for 2 years. The total investment of $700 million equals approximately $11 billion in 2025 values. Second largest industrial project of the war after Manhattan. And while Manhattan produced 2 bombs, synthetic rubber produced 2,300,000 tons of material that sustained every aspect of Allied war machinery. The transformation of dependence was permanent and irreversible. In 1941, 87% of American rubber was imported. In 1945, 87% of rubber used by the Allies was American synthetic. The number wasn't just inverted, it was amplified because total consumption had grown massively. Each Sherman tank required half a ton of rubber. Each B-17 bomber used almost a complete ton. Each Jeep needed more than 100 kilos. Each Liberty ship had more than 20,000 rubber components. And all this was being produced without a single rubber tree from Southeast Asia. The Japanese blockade didn't just fail, it became so completely irrelevant that by 1944, Allied strategists didn't even consider Southeast Asian reconquest as priority for rubber. It would be reconquered for strategic and humanitarian reasons, but not for natural resource necessity. The Americans had abolished necessity. The technical legacy remains dominant 80 years later. Approximately 70% of all rubber produced globally today is still synthetic, fundamentally based on processes developed during 1942-1945. SBR, the commercial successor to GRS developed under war pressure, became standard material for automotive tires worldwide. Its chemical descendants, nitrile rubbers, neoprene, silicones, dominate industrial applications. The synthetic rubber revolution didn't just win the war. It permanently transformed global chemical industry, proving that synthetic polymers could equal or exceed natural materials at commercial scale. It was proof of concept for entire synthetic materials revolution that would follow. Plastics, synthetic fibers, composite materials. The message was clear. Nature doesn't determine limits. Engineering determines. Jesse Jones, United States Secretary of Commerce and Administrator of Rubber Reserve Company, wrote in 1945, "Synthetic rubber proved that the United States can abolish scarcity through engineering when necessary. Japan tried to economically strangle us by cutting access to natural resources they judged essential. We responded by making those natural resources obsolete. We built 51 factories in less time than they took to organize administration of conquered territories. We produced more synthetic rubber than the world produced natural, and we did this while simultaneously building the largest navy in history, the largest air force, and invading 2 continents. This is the difference between nation that depends on resources and nation that manufactures abundance." The statement wasn't arrogance, it was recognition of mathematically demonstrated fact. The contrast with Axis reflections was devastating. Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production, wrote in his memoirs, "Inside the Third Reich, we fundamentally underestimated American capacity to create entire industries during wartime. When Japan cut American access to natural rubber in 1942, we thought it was potentially mortal blow to their capacity to sustain mechanized warfare. We calculated their reserves would last 6 to 9 months maximum. In 18 months, they had built 51 massive chemical factories and were producing more synthetic rubber monthly than the entire world produced natural rubber annually before the war. We didn't lose war to braver soldiers or smarter generals. We lost to a nation that can manufacture reality when natural reality doesn't cooperate with their objectives. Germany developed synthetic Buna rubber in the 1930s. We had a decade's technical advantage. But industrial fragmentation and resource scarcity prevented production at necessary scale. Americans took our chemistry, industrialized it, and produced at volumes we considered theoretically impossible. It was lesson of industrial warfare we learned too late to matter. Interrogations of captured Japanese officers revealed consistent theme of fundamental incomprehension. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, captured in the Philippines in March 1945, told interrogators, "We planned Southern strategy based on denying critical resources to enemy. Rubber was most critical resource identified. We correctly calculated their reserves. We correctly calculated time until exhaustion of those reserves. We didn't calculate that they would simply create synthetic substitute at industrial scale that made our natural resource control irrelevant. How do you plan war against enemy that can abolish scarcity through engineering? All our strategic assumptions were based on natural resource limitations. They abolished those limitations. There is no doctrine for this. The permanent lesson of synthetic rubber transcends chemistry and manufacturing. It definitively proved that in total industrial warfare, natural resource control is completely irrelevant against capacity to manufacture mass substitutes. Japan's perfect blockade, conquering 97% of world production of essential resource, was made obsolete in less time than military ships took to circumnavigate globe. The strategy that should guarantee victory through resource strangulation became historical footnote about underestimating industrial capacity. Nations that depend on scarcity strategies, denying resources to enemy, controlling critical natural sources, waiting for material limitations to paralyze adversaries, cannot defeat nations that abolish scarcity through engineering and mass production. Its lesson relearned in each conflict since 1945. Abundance is manufactured state, not natural. A nation that can manufacture abundance faster than enemy can impose scarcity will win regardless of tactical or territorial advantages. Synthetic rubber didn't just save Allied war effort, it permanently redefined nature of modern industrial power. Tojo was right that he had cut America's industrial arteries. He was wrong in assuming America